Shana Tova. Ayeka. Where are you? This is God's first question to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Every year on the high holidays, we take stock of where we are, how we got here, and where we are going. But this year, that question of Ayeka can bring us pain. For many of us, we've been in the very same physical space since March. This year, I want to suggest that we ask a different question. Instead of, where am I think we need to begin asking, who am I? And while this shift of questions is inspired by the reality of the world brought on by coronavirus, there have been many reasons for a long time now why we need to start asking who instead of where. In our modern world, as evidenced by the way I'm delivering this sermon right now, where we are, our physical location, matters less than it used to. In the ancient world, where you were likely told me a great deal about you. I could guess with great accuracy what language or languages you spoke, what god or gods you worshipped, what foods you ate, and what clothing you wore. As my teacher, Dr. Elsie Stern, used to tell us, if you woke up an ancient Israelite in the middle of the night and said, "Quick, what's the purpose of your life? What is it all about?" they'd likely answer, God, Torah, and Israel. And they likely would have answered in Hebrew or Aramaic. We could predict that with a great deal of accuracy. But today, where I am is no longer indicative of who I am. This fact came into the limelight in a town in Montana in 2018. One evening, a Border Patrol agent detained Martha Hernandez and Ana Suda and asked to see their identification because they were speaking Spanish. Speaking Spanish, in the words of the agent, is very unheard of up here. Both women were born in the United States and thus, by the law of our land, are United States citizens. This incident was a reminder that location, even if that location is our home, is no longer such a sure predictor of the languages we speak. If you walked into a synagogue in ancient Israel and spoke with the worshipers, you would likely find uniformity regarding where the worshipers were directing their prayers. They would be directing them, of course, to the God of Israel. Flash forward to our days, and this isn't necessarily the case. In a 2013 Pew study, it was determined that 68% of Jews find that it is completely compatible to not believe in God and still be Jewish. This means it could be the case that more than half of us listening to this sermon today are likely praying to whom it may concern today, instead of directly to the God of Israel. And if you were to take a snapshot of our dinner plates, without context, just before we began to dig in, it would be no indication of where we were in the world. Italian, Chinese, Japanese, Mediterranean, Mexican, deli. All of these styles of food can be on our plate at any given night here in Philadelphia. Being in Philly does not mean that every night for dinner we have soft pretzels and cheesesteaks, with kosher steak and non-dairy cheese, of course. Our location also used to be able to tell us where we belonged. In the ancient world, to be kicked out of the community or to be thrown out of the camp meant almost certain death. There would be nowhere to go, and there would be a high likelihood that even if you did find another community or nation to be a part of, you would live out your days as a servant at best. Today, our location no longer necessarily determines with whom we associate or where we belong. Perhaps the best representation of this is in the form of a joke. Mr. Cohen was stranded on an island alone for many years. When he was finally rescued, the rescuers toured the island and asked him about the 3 structures the man built on the island. Mr. Cohen explained, "This one over here, this is my home." And the rescuers said, "But what about those 2 over there?" "Ah, that one is my synagogue." And they said, "And the one next door?" "Oh, that's the old synagogue. No one goes there anymore." Today, even being stranded on a desert island doesn't prohibit us from choosing our own affiliations. For all these reasons and more, the question of ayeka, where are you, says much less about us than it used to. That is why it is time for us to begin asking the question, who are you? In the ancient world, there was very little room to question who you were. The world answered that for you. You were born into an economic and social class. You were born into a gender. And in some cases, you were betrothed before the age when modern kids would even start kindergarten. But somewhere along the centuries, that began to change. And in the past century, this revolution has picked up steam. Think of the stories that we as a Jewish people have been telling ourselves for over a generation now. Think of Barbara Streisand in Yentl, a woman born into a traditional Jewish household who wanted to study Torah but was told she couldn't because of her gender. So she dressed as a man and studied. Even in Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye, the very man who sings all day about tradition that he was born into and his lot in life that was given to him from on high, Tevye has children who reject being told who and what they have to be. His children go on to decide for themselves who they are and how they will live their lives. In our times, we form who we are. We form our identity. We choose the food we eat, where we live, our clothing, our gender expression, and who we love. Our lives, in many ways, are spent answering the question, who am I? So here comes the big question. Does Judaism now belong in the category of identity? And if yes, if we are the sole masters of how we identify, who gets to decide who is Jewish? Can a person who was not born into Jewish family wake up one morning and decide, I'm now Jewish? Can a person who was born into a Jewish family wake up one morning and decide, I'm no longer Jewish? The answer from the Jewish religious tradition is a resounding no. Being Jewish is not a matter of individual choice without taking the proper steps. But lived experience shows us that it's much more complicated than that. For millennia, the Jewish authorities have argued over Jewish status, and the criteria has changed over the years. In biblical times, to be born a Jew depended on who your father was. And in the Hebrew Bible, a conversion was as simple as uttering the words as Ruth did, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. That all shifted in Talmudic times. Being born into the Jewish people was based on who your mother was. And suddenly, there were far more requirements for those who wanted to join our people through the means of conversion. Today, different movements of Judaism give different answers to the question of Jewish status. The Israeli rabbinate, for example, won't even recognize many American Orthodox conversions, let alone the more religiously progressive movements like ours. While I said just a few moments ago that people don't get to decide for themselves who is Jewish and who is not, the current situation does put a great deal of agency in the hands of the individual as they identify as they wish. Perhaps more than ever before, the people get to decide what kind of Jewish person they will be. A person who claims Judaism as their own upon waking up one morning may not be recognized as Jewish, but that person does get to choose how they would convert. So in the eyes of Israel's Orthodox rabbinate, for example, converting under Reform auspices is pretty much the same as someone waking up one morning and deciding to be Jewish. So who is a Jew? And who gets to decide? The bottom line is that it is a messy business trying to figure that out. And few stories show just how complicated these issues of identity are, more than Shmuel Oswald Rufeisen. In 1922, Shmuel Oswald Rufeisen was born into a Jewish family in Poland. He grew up as a part of the Zionist youth movement. In 1941, now in his late teens, he came to the town of Mir with false papers and worked as a translator in the local police department. During his time there, Shmuel Rufeisen informed the Jews of Mir about what would soon happen, that the Nazis were coming. Rufeisen helped hundreds of Jews escape the town. Many fled into the woods, and others joined resistance groups before the catastrophic events perpetrated by the Nazis hit their town of Mir. Rufeisen continued his work until eventually his actions were discovered. Knowing that the Nazis were looking for him, Rufeisen hid at a local convent, the Convent of the Sisters of the Resurrection. While in hiding and living with the Sisters of the convent in secret, Rufeisen discovered and converted to Christianity. After the war, he became a Carmelite friar and eventually a Catholic priest. He took on the name by which he is known much more famously, Brother Daniel. In the early 1950s, Shmuel Oswald Rufeisen, born to a Jewish family in Poland, applied for citizenship in the State of Israel under Israel's law of return, which allows Jews to return to their ancestral homeland. But he was not hiding anything. He was upfront about the fact that he was now known as Brother Daniel, a Catholic priest from Poland as well. Brother Daniel argued that although his religion was Catholicism, he still identified as Jewish. He said, "My ethnic origin is and always will be Jewish. I have no other nationality. If I am not a Jew, what am I? I did not accept Christianity to leave my people. I added it to my Judaism. I feel as a Jew." The State of Israel denied his request to return under the law of return. He appealed that decision, and the case rose all the way to the Supreme Court. The court upheld the ruling that Brother Daniel could not receive citizenship under Israel's law of return. The story has a happy ending for Brother Daniel. Although he couldn't return under the law of return, he did move to Israel and eventually became a naturalized citizen. He lived in Haifa at the Stella Maris Carmelite Monastery. Here's the part of the story that both fascinates me and honestly keeps me awake at night. Despite the Israeli government's decision and despite the Supreme Court upholding the ruling, that didn't change the fact that Brother Daniel, a Catholic priest, identified as a Jew. And even more remarkably, listen to the words of Yehuda Packer, a Holocaust survivor who made Aliyah to Israel. Rufeisen, now Brother Daniel, had a role in saving the man's life. Packer spoke the following words in 1991 at the Mir Immigrants Gathering in Israel. This quote can be found on the website of Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial and Museum. "The destruction of the Jews in our ghetto was no different from the fate of all other Jewish communities, great and small, across Nazified Europe. We, the sons and daughters of the town of Mir, remember the man and the phenomenon named Oswald, thanks to whom we fled, whoever fled, by the skin of our teeth. You, Shmuel, belong to us alone, to the survivors and to those who died from the Mir ghetto. You belong to the Jews, and above all, to the Jews of Mir, dearest Shmuel, and forgive me that I find it hard to call you Brother Daniel. Not only did Brother Daniel identify as Jewish, but Yehuda Packer said that he will always belong. What wasn't said, but I believe is implied here, is you'll always belong no matter what the Israeli Supreme Court says, and no matter what you believe. Regardless of where you stand on the controversial Brother Daniel case, it highlights a trend about Judaism in the 20th and 21st centuries. Judaism is becoming an identity. Are our Jewish institutions ready for this? Frankly, I don't think so. But even if we are not ready for this shift, and even if we want to hold up against it perhaps, one thing is certain. It's time for us to start teaching Judaism in terms of identity. Because the language of identity is the language that we, and especially our young people, understand. Like so many new ideas, Judaism as identity not only presents challenges to the status quo, it also brings great opportunity. Many professionals who earn titles like doctor, your honor, or even rabbi or cantor, in their first few days or even months at work, often feel a sense of not really deserving the title, or just feel uncomfortable being called by their title until they finally adjust to it. It's not because they haven't earned it, it's because identity is something that takes time and practice and ritual to form inside us. That's why doctors and lawyers and CPAs have graduations. Even after the years of study, they need a ritual to tell them, yes, you really deserve the title that you earned. You are that title. It represents you. Identity is something we feel inside and something we can share with the world in spoken and in unspoken ways. We wrestle with our identity and we examine it. And identity is crafted through years of practice, and it is ultimately the answer to the question, who are you? Our Judaism, and the Judaism of our young people, is at risk of being relegated to the box we check on a questionnaire under the headline, religion. But if we seek to understand and teach Judaism as an identity, it may inspire us to live out our Jewish values and engage with Jewish ritual on a regular basis. So if you identify as Jewish, what will that look like for you? The rabbis of old tell us that crafting Jewish identity begins with your Jewish status, with prayer 3 times a day, with blessings before pretty much everything, keeping kosher, regular text study, the list goes on and on. And I want to be very clear, I'm not discouraging these things. In fact, we invite you to explore them, and we at Congregation Beth Or are happy to help you explore any and all of these rituals and what it might do for you. But seeing Judaism as an identity blows the doors wide open with possibility. Watch an Israeli show on Netflix this year. Learn 10 modern Hebrew phrases. Make 12 posts on social media that are relevant to the Jewish people. Read a Philip Roth novel or read a poem by Yehuda Amichai. Many of those poems, by the way, you'll find in your high holiday prayer books. Judaism is very much a religion, but we American Jews are far more fluent in the language of identity than we are in the language of religion. So make Judaism your identity also. Make it something that is a part of you. Ayeka, where are you, is a tough question to answer this year. Many of us are at home and limited in our ability to do the things we used to do before coronavirus hit our world. But who are you is a question we can answer every single time. Every single moment, wherever we may find ourselves, we can grasp onto our identity. We can make ourselves known. We can make ourselves live out our values, and answer that powerful question, who are you? Shana Tova.